John, how you doing? This is Glenn Loury with John McWhorter. It's the Glenn Show at bloggingheads.tv, coming from the Watson Institute on International and Public Affairs here at Brown University, where I teach. John teaches at Columbia University. We are the Black guys at bloggingheads.tv. We monthly or so conduct a conversation about race, politics, intellectual life, culture in America. And we're back. We're back, John. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much. There's a lot to talk about. We could do one of those year-end things where, you know, what were the 5 things or whatever, but let's not.
I can't think of what the 5 things were.
Well, having to think of them,
think we need to
having to think of them spontaneously is one of the reasons not to do it without warning. But the other reason is it's a banal exercise that is beneath our dignity. And we are high-minded folk here who talk about the deep ideas, not about the trivia. So,
you know, to tell you the truth, also, race has not really been super important news since last January. I think the country's had its mind on so many other things. And there's certainly been things to talk about. But it's funny,
Okay.
I'm having a hard time thinking of any signature events at this point. Am I missing
because
something?
Black Lives Matter stuff has kind of died down, because Obama is no longer president. Because Trump is Darth Vader evil for so many other reasons besides being a racist that one is way down the list.
Exactly. Nobody talks about hip hop anymore. I mean, there's been the whole affirmative action case, which we've talked about.
Well, we should talk about that.
Yeah, but it hasn't happened yet. That's really going to be this coming year's issue.
Yeah, the district court's decision will come in the spring, and then it'll get kicked up to the appellate level and to the Supreme Court ultimately, and we will see what we will see. And if I were hard pressed, what would be my racial incident, politics, culture, high points of the last year? I'm not sure I know, so I don't want to challenge myself with that task. I prefer to talk about a piece that you have in the current issue of the Atlantic Monthly Online, where I want you to summarize your piece. I don't remember the title of it exactly right now, but I understand you to be arguing that this latter-day new wave anti-racism movement in which we are awash will peter out or not get to where it's trying to get to, and you try to give a reason or an account why. You want to talk about a little bit about, set that up, your piece we can talk about?
Yeah, and I'm going to throw you a little bit of a curveball, because the piece in the Atlantic, it's called something about virtue signaling. To be honest, I think you all know out there that we don't write the titles. I forget what they call it. But the piece that's in the Atlantic is another rendition of this whole anti-racism as religion idea that I've been putting forth over the years. And I first did it in the Daily Beast, and then I did it in the American Interest, and those are great publications, but it's now something along those lines is now in the Atlantic, and it has a certain reach. And I make some points.
That's a bully or pulpit. Excuse me. It's a bully or pulpit for sure.
I think a lot of our audience have heard my basic argument about the religious aspect and how it's really more about the white people than the black people. But what the Atlantic piece was really designed to get across is something, Glenn, that I think we need to talk about. Because one thing that has happened this year, second half of this year, when it comes to race, although really we're just talking about social justice warrior movements in general, is there's a new pushback that's happening. And it's coming from people who, are perfectly intelligent, and it's important for people to say this. They're saying that stuff about safe spaces and microaggressions, etc., when really we're just talking about some under-occupied 20-year-olds on a few college campuses. Why are we media people paying all of this attention to these little protests at Yale and, incidents that happen at Pomona? What does this have to do with society at large? And the reason that concerns me is because I don't think we're just talking about campuses. You and I happen to teach on campuses, and campuses have a way of focusing this feeling, and the media tends to cover Charles Murray getting chased off of the campus. But we're talking about a society-wide mood, and it's something that actually I will shout out once again Megan Daum's piece from, I believe it was late August, that got across that this is just conversations that you have at what used to be called a cocktail party, or, not just college campuses, but the media in general. It's larger than that. We're talking about the anthropology of modern educated America, not just something that happens in a cafeteria. And I tried to get that across in the piece, that we're talking about a national mood. Now, yeah, mostly among the intelligentsia. It is not everybody. But still, it's larger than somebody not wanting Heather McDonald to have her say in some auditorium. Do you see what I mean? I thought we needed to push that.
And I agree with you that it's certainly not, the phenomenon we're talking about is not limited to the campus. And I also agree that the dismissal of the phenomenon as, just the excesses of, quote, political correctness in some generic sense, without giving a more, precise dissection of what's exactly going on, is not intellectually worthy. I agree with all that. I was going to remark and allow you to go on because I know you have a lot to say about this. I was going to remark that you're the one who usually makes this point about social media, about Twitter, and people being online and things going viral and things like that. Little incidents like a kid finding something that he thinks is a noose near his dormitory door, or like somebody saying to somebody something, "I'm not sure if you belong here. Let me see your ID," when in fact they, are enrolled or whatever. Or like being asked to leave a Starbucks when the manager there doesn't think that you're behaving in a way that's consistent with your presence in the establishment or whatever. These things become national phenomena because people are able to share their common knowledge of the phenomena. It's not just that the phenomena has happened. It's not just that a lot of people know about it. It's that a lot of people know about a lot of people knowing about it. It becomes, driving while Black, barbecuing while Black, swimming while Black, shopping while Black, walking while Black. And this is a trope, or I'm not sure what the right word is here, but it's a, performance. It's a certain role. It's a certain posture. And it becomes a thing unto itself. And when millions or tens of millions of people are focusing in on the same events and are reinforcing each other in their comments and their likes and their cocktail party conversation and whatnot, it becomes a substitute for a systematic analysis of what's actually happening. It becomes decoupled from reality. It has, as it were, a life of its own. And that's, at least I put that bit in there because I'm always asking people who come to me with these incidents, why do we care? Why do I care whether a woman was asked to put out her cigarette when a police officer stopped her for a broken taillight on a dusty road in Arizona? Why do I care about that? Really? That's emblematic of the treatment, quote unquote, the treatment of Black people in this country, close quote. I'm a social scientist. I don't operate based on, a few anecdotes about what's happening, but it fits and feeds into a narrative, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to add that I think the networking, common knowledge, viral, social construction of something that's not really politics. It's not really the substance of our social lives. It's an exaggerated projection of something that's kind of on the surface of our lives, something like that.
Well, I think that what we do need to consider is that there's a kind of person who's now charting all of those incidents. And remember, this summer we started calling it Starbucks and the swimming pool. And what that person is thinking is that kind of racist bias is why Black people have larger problems. And I didn't stress this too much in the Atlantic piece. I have a couple of sentences about it. But this new idea that you're supposed to focus on psychology rather than structure is out of a sense that the reason that the cop tells the person to put out the cigarette, the reason that the woman assumes that the person isn't supposed to be barbecuing or tells the guy at the pool to put on his socks, the reason is because of this quiet or even not so quiet racist bias, and that kind of bias, in some abstract sense, compounded, is why so many Black people live in substandard housing, why Black people have health problems, et cetera. And you notice that when I say that, anybody can hear how the links are getting looser and looser. And what I always ask is, if the boys are shooting each other over sneakers in Chicago and other cities every summer over nothing in particular, what does that have to do with that swimming pool bias? And there's some people who will say, well, America doesn't love them. But that's not a statement, that's a song. What is the direct relationship? And I think that what people genuinely don't understand is that the sociology and the structures can change even if the bias that leads people to make those assumptions about Black people stays exactly where it is. The whole problem with our modern sense of what to do about race and racism is this notion that Black people can only get ahead if there's this massive psychological transformation, and that until no woman sees a Black man she's never seen before sitting by the pool and calls the police, until nothing like that happens, then Black boys are going to, have the problem in inner cities with the guns, and there are going to be any number of other problems that we have. We're even supposed to think, for example, that it's that kind of bias that means that so few, even middle-class Black students, submit tippy-top level dossiers to selective universities. The link is a myth. And yet the kind of person who I'm going to call him randomly Jared. Jared is right now listening to us, and he's kind of got his cheeks sucking. Wow, oh, racism. The reason he's been taught to feel that way is because he thinks that that kind of racism is why Black America is behind. And the truth is that, as hard as it would be for many people to hear this of all colors, that's just not true. And the question is how to get that across to people as something other than, quote unquote, stirring up the pot. So those people are making sense. They think that the swimming pool stuff is why there's a ghetto. The thing is, that doesn't really make any sense, or at least only Black people are expected to subscribe to that particular kind of history. Nobody else, has that story. That's just us.
Well, I think your diagnosis is accurate, that people are ascribing a causal role to the evidence that they find everywhere of racism in America that accounts for Black disadvantage, and they're daring you to contradict or disagree with them, because either if you do, you're saying it's something wrong with Black people, with Black culture. You're saying Blacks are inherently inferior. Otherwise, how could you explain? You're saying Blacks don't put in the effort. In fact, you see a slew of pieces. Jamel Bowie has one that's just very recent, where he's explaining why the Democrats' white candidates for 2020 are going to likely have some problem because they need to court the Black vote, and yet they don't know how to do so while playing for the middle ground white who might swung over to Trump in 2016. And he's talking about how many white people believe that Black people's disadvantage is due to their lack of effort rather than due to discrimination. And it's like, it's self-evident to him that if you say it's due to lack of effort, you must be a racist and you're someone who's likely to vote for Trump. And as you point out, it's not at all self-evident, which is why I say these people are bluffing. Although, I don't know if that analogy holds up to scrutiny, but I mean, they don't have any cards. I can tell you that much. I mean, what are they saying? I'm agreeing with you now. They're saying mass incarceration is racism. The Blacks in jails is racism. It's a sign of American racism. And if you say, well, no, it's mainly a sign of the pathological behavior of criminals who happen to be Black. I'm not saying that it's because they're Black, but I'm saying that the jails are full of people who broke the law, who hurt people, who stole something, who violated the rules of the basic rules of civility in society. That's what prison is. Prison is not a conspiracy to confine Black people. Oh, yes, it is. Prison school to prison pipeline. Okay, so then we go down into the fever swamps. We go down into the religion. But as a matter of fact, those kids with pistols who are taking each other's lives on the street of St. Louis and Baltimore and Chicago are exhibiting behavioral pathology that is standard deviations off the chart. And the people who are bearing the cost of it are Black people. And an ideology that ascribes that to racism is a bluff. It's laughable. It can't be taken seriously, not by serious people. Nobody believes it. Nobody believes it. I'm maintaining. Not really. Maybe a few self-deluded social justice warriors really believe it, but most people are ashamed of the pathology and the failure that is exhibited in this behavior, and you're being dared to call it what it is, the test score gap. Maybe we'll get to talking about this affirmative action kids at Harvard. And I won't go on very long. I just want to give several illustrations of the general point that I'm making. The point that I'm making is that, yes, people ascribe these differences to racism, and yet, no, I don't think any sensible person actually believes that they're due to racism. And it's all a bluff. They're daring you to call their bluff. They're daring you to say, some groups are sending kids to these elite universities whose academic preparation is magnitudes higher and better and finer. These are achievements. You're not born knowing these things. You acquire them through effort. Now, why have some acquired and others have not? That's a very deep question, which I'd be prepared to entertain. But the simplistic answer, racism, is laughable. And if you think it doesn't have anything to do with behavior, with cultural patterns, with peer groups, with how people spend their time, with what they value, you're a fool. You know, Asians are a model minority. Well, as a matter of fact, if you read Min Zhou and Jennifer Lee's book, The Asian American Achievement Paradox, where they interviewed 200 plus families in Southern California to try to find out how these kids get into Dartmouth and Columbia and Cornell with such high rates, you'll find that they do have cultural patterns, values, practices, behaviors, disciplines that orient them in a way that facilitates their achievement. It's ridiculous to assert that they don't. Or conversely, that the paucity of African Americans performing at the very top of the intellectual spectrum, I'm talking about excellence, and they're few, that has nothing to do with the behavior of Black people, that it's due entirely to institutional forces. It's an absurdity. Nobody believes it. Nobody believes that 70% of African American babies being born to a woman without a husband is A, good. Nobody thinks it's good. Or B, due to racism. They say it, but they don't believe it. They're bluffing. So here's the deal, in my opinion, I'll stop. Early 21st century failure of African Americans to take advantage of the opportunities created by the Civil Rights Revolution. You have your three-part development in your piece. You say the end of slavery, the end of segregation, and now what? Well, the end of segregation was a huge, big deal. As Joe Biden told Obama, it's a big fucking deal. The end of segregation was a big deal, okay? The fact that here we are a half century down the line from that, and that we have all these gaps, all these disparities. You talking about the wealth gap? Start a business, darn it. You know, you act as if pointing to the absence of wealth in the African American community is ipso facto an indictment of the system, while the Caribbean and African immigrants who are Black are starting businesses, penetrating the professions, presenting themselves at Ivy League institutions in outsized numbers, and doing everything else that a country with the streets paved with gold, that happens to be the United States of America, do. They're behaving, although Black, like other immigrant groups. Yes, they're immigrants, they're not natives. Yes, immigration is different from native selection and so forth and so on. I get that. But the fact of the matter is, 70% of the babies born to women who are not married, and there's no discussion of it, there's no commentary, and you dare anybody to say anything about it, and if they make a judgment, then they become a racist? That's laughable. Nobody believes it.
Yeah, and it's funny, I'm listening to you and I'm just thinking, the parishioners have developed so many counter arguments, and so you got into the whole wealth issue, which is very fashionable now.
Yeah, it is.
So, you know, Black families don't have wealth, and the statistics are, you know, incredible. And that's, you know, largely because of redlining, you know, which continued into the 70s. And so people didn't get to, you know, have equities rise on their houses, et cetera. And if you don't have that kind of wealth, then that means that you can't present a tippy-top dossier to college. Why? Well, the idea is that, for one thing, you can't afford the SAT prep courses that allow you to do well on those tests. Now, of course, that's only a partial answer, but you're not supposed to ask any more questions because this is a religion. Or you mention the Caribbean and African immigrants, certainly, and, you know, especially if you teach at an Ivy school, you notice that disproportion in terms of the Black students. Well, you're not supposed to talk about that because immigrants have a certain kind of pluck, as it's often put. It's always that word, pluck, that native-born Black people can't be expected to have. And therefore, no, they don't have the wealth, but they've got the immigrant pluck. And so there's always something. And what it comes down to is what you're saying is that, I mean, Jamel Bowie is a very typical example, and I'm using him by name because he is so damn good at what he does in general. But I frankly find that when it comes to this very small question of race and racism, his views are, I'll put it as, I find him predictable. And I think that it's because, to him, it genuinely is that either it's racism or you're saying there's something wrong with people. And I don't think he's faking. And I'm going to stop saying him because I don't want us to start, making it seem like we're jumping on him. But that kind of person really does think that if it isn't racism, then you're criticizing. For one thing, that's what you're taught in school. The more educated you are, the more you've been taught to think that way. And it seems charitable. It feels like something that you say because you don't wish to dump on a people who've been through so much. And I frankly also think, Glenn, that there's an extent to which it's survivor's guilt. If you are one of us who's really lucky, the very last thing you want to do is diss somebody who's out on the corners. And so that explanation is something that you're going to hold on to like you hold on to an inner tube when you're in the middle of the sea. I get it. And I don't think that those people know deep down that they're kidding themselves. I think they really believe it. But what they are lacking is, I think that in some ways, I'm not good at money. You know, I was at a store the other day, I was getting new contact lenses and they were talking to me about rebates. And I had to tell them, and I'm not being dramatic, I said, "Miss, I'm sorry, I don't know what that is." I said, "My wife does all of this. I don't know what a rebate is. I don't know what you're trying to explain. Could I please come back in a week?" That's genuine. I'm going to tell you something else. I don't know what a second mortgage is. I've heard the term, but I have no idea. That's my ignorance. Okay. Now, I think that a lot of people these days, we're going to look back on the early 21st century, and we're going to be surprised at how elementary some people's understanding of social history and sociology can be, in that if a group is having problems, it's either that everybody else doesn't like them or there's something wrong with them, when it could be something in between. And so the reason, for example, that so few middle-class Black students submit tippy-tippy-top dossiers is not because the middle-class Black boy gets stopped at a mall by a guard who thinks he stole a shirt. That's not why. It's not racism in any sense that we would really say. On the other hand, it's not that there's something wrong with Black people. It's not that Black people are stupid. It's not that Black people are unfamiliar with hard work. A lot of it is, and this is what I was trying to say in Losing the Race, and I've continued to say, that in the 1960s, when they really started enforcing desegregation of schools, a lot of the teachers were racist and didn't treat Black kids very well. And so by about 1966, that year particularly, Black kids started disidentifying from school as something that white people do. That's when people started saying, "What do you think, you're white for liking school?" And ever since then, there's been this subtle meme in a lot of the Black community that says that you hit the books in order to get something done. You're stepping outside of your real self, and you might do very well at that, but it's going to pull down your performance in general. Whereas everybody else is in school because school is what they do. School is for white people. We just use it in order to get a piece of paper. And that, I think, is a lot of the reason that you have so few Black families, even ones who have a lot of money, who can have their kids submit that tippy-tippy-top dossier. It's subtle, but it's powerful, and it has nothing to do with racism, nor does it have anything to do with stupidity. It has to do with the ordinary complexity of the procession of human affairs. And I think that the people we're talking about have been trained to not think about that when it comes to Black people. And I think partly it's because sociology is not explicit enough, partly because of the strong leftward tilt of sociology, to actually allow that there is a such thing as a negative cultural trait that is not the result of present day oppression. Because many people, the Larry Bobos or whatever, will say, "Oh, well, yes, that's a negative trait, but the reason that they're that way is because of the racism that surrounds them." And the typical op-ed page only knows that. The typical op-ed page doesn't know that a negative cultural trait can persist long past what the original cause was. That's considered a very strange thing to say.
There's also a problem here of just logical consistency, because if indeed I adopt this deterministic worldview in which the negative cultural expressions are themselves a necessary consequence of oppression, then it would appear to follow that the positive cultural expressions are also a necessary consequence of oppression. If I can't take responsibility for my failures, how is it that I get to take responsibility for my successes? If I'm indeed a bauble at the end of a string and history is pushing hither and yon, then I'm a bauble at the end of a string pushed hither and yon by history. I don't have any agency. I don't get any glory. I don't have any responsibility. Well, I don't get any credit. I don't have any skin in the game. Nothing's on me. Nothing's on me.
Yeah.
I'm serious about this, that there's an existential, philosophical kind of dimension to this. I mean, I can't help the hand that I was dealt. The issue is how I'm going to play the hand that I'm dealt. if I cast myself as victim, if my Weltanschauung, the way I see the world, how I understand experience, is filtered constantly and at every instance through a sieve that catches everything that I had control over, you know, and leaves it all to the gods. And in fact, that's what we're talking about. We're gesturing up at the celestial moving bodies, and we're saying it controls our fate. There's something deeply, profoundly pathetic about that. And the idea that it's associated with freedom, I thought the quest, you know, the old quest from abolition onward, this is not freedom in the 21st century. So it's time to perform without a net. It's time to step out on the wire and actually take our chances that we're not as good at physics as the Jews. Right? Okay? Rather than saying that the protocols of the elders of Zion is the reason that so many Jews have Nobel Prizes in physics, is the reason that so many concert pianists and violinists are Jewish, is the reason, etc. I could go on for a very long time. Rather than saying that they're white and they therefore got the benefit of every doubt. When they came out of shtetls in Eastern Europe, some of them did, and you know the whole story of the 20th century and Jews. Rather than ascribing that, I'm talking about as a Black intellectual, as a pundit who might write for the Atlantic or the Daily Beast and try to comprehend what's going on with Black people today. Rather than looking at how many billionaires belong to which group, and there are not so many Black billionaires, and woe is me, and ascribing that to some invisible force called racism, you took responsibility. You owned up to the fact that you're never going to be a billionaire unless you build $1 billion business. And that actually requires starting a business and building it. You're never going to master the fiddle. We can master the saxophone. We can master the fiddle if that's what it came to, without thousands of hours of practice. You're never going to win a Nobel Prize in physics unless you learn calculus when you're 12 years old. What parent is teaching their kids calculus when they're 12 years old? White people are not responsible for the fact that Black people are or are not doing that. There's something soul killing about this way of looking at the conditions of African Americans. There's something profoundly pathetic about it.
Yeah, there is. And we're just at a point where I think this elementary understanding of sociology, especially when it's applied to brown people, really does keep people from thinking beyond a certain paradigm. Because, you know, there are always answers. And there's a whole article to be written about the place of rhyming and rhythm in rhetorical discourse among African American people. But yeah, there's something that rhymes that I think, you know, if we were doing this live with the wrong audience, we would be shut down by somebody who stood up. How did it go? If you're white, you're all right. If you're brown, stick around. If you're Black, get back. The idea being that the reason that, you know, we can't build anything is because there's just this racism around that keeps us from being able to do what the Jews did because, and somebody always stands up and says, because they were white. And then everybody goes, they were white. And you talk about the Irish and the way the Irish used to basically be Black people with white faces and in terms of their inner city behavior. No, but they were white. And so that's just considered to be logic itself. And, you know, the thing about this year, though, Glenn, is this. I think something has happened this year. There's been a pushback. There's been a pushback against some of the stuff we've been complaining about. It's this SJW movement in general, but let's face it, what most people think of first with the social justice warriors is racism, and there's a reason. And I think that the way we were talking about this 2 years ago with a certain despair, there's been a pushback ever since about the middle of the summer. A number of smart people have been writing, and not just in Quillette, that there's been an excess, that yes, social justice needs to be pursued. And social justice is not just about crosses being burned on people's lawns, yes, but that the tone of our times, and not just in terms of somebody acting up in a dormitory, has gone too far. And it leads me to think that, how do you measure when something is really changing? And what I would like to see in 2019 is this. It's one thing if somebody like you or me or Coleman reaches somebody who already prides themselves on being some sort of contrarian. mean, because the truth is that those of us who are the black, I guess the fashionable term nowadays is heterodox thinkers, we're all people who kind of march to our own drummer. None of us are joiners. Like I remember 2002, me, Shelby Steele, Larry Elder, Tom Sowell, and Walter Williams all in a restaurant. And you can just imagine, we all had a very nice time. And the idea was we were going to build something. And, you know, nothing came of it. And I think we all knew deep down that it wasn't going to. And it's because all five of us are not joiners. That's part of why we don't end up thinking like the other people. And if that sounds a little condescending towards them, I'm sorry, maybe it is. But I think part of what we're talking about is a kind of groupthink. You learn to suspend your disbelief when it comes to the local topic of race, and that's whatever color you happen to be. If you happen to make, partly for biological reasons, not to be that type, maybe we're all a little bit on the spectrum, then you end up, you know, thinking in a different way. And I think that's still the way it is. If we convince people who are also that type, not joiners, kind of contrarians, you know, not inclined to follow what other people think because they don't have that basic need for the warmth of human concurrence that it seems that most people need. And I envy them. I'm like on the outside of the playground. Love is clearly part of this. Maybe we just don't need it. Reaching those sorts of people is one thing. I want to start reaching the people who are joiners. I want to start hearing from the people who do need the warmth and the love of large numbers of people, you know, agreeing with them, who, you know, are not strange. I'm strange. I openly admit it. I don't know if you want to call yourself that. But,
no, I don't.
Okay. And I would like to start seeing this reach the joiners. And maybe that'll happen this year. Joiners, as in people who don't think of themselves as puckish people who go against the grain and are ready to hear something different, but people who just think, you know what? I am a group person. I am part of a larger entity, but I am tired of this old way because it's an insult to the people that I'm claiming to be behind. I'd like to see that in 2019.
All right. Well, I wouldn't hold my breath. From your lips to God's ears, as they say.
I hope.
You know, but I like that distinction that you make between joiners and people who won't follow any crowd anywhere. And I gather we are of that ilk, as are Tom Sowell, Walter Williams, Shelby Steele, and Larry Elder.
You think of all
those guys are real conservatives.
You're real ones. Right.
But I wanted to say a couple of things. One thing I wanted to say was False Black Power. That's the title of Jason Riley's little book, False Black Power. And in your article, you have a discussion of the N-word and the prohibition on the use of the N-word by certain people.
Mm-hmm.
And it struck me as quintessentially, you're a linguist, and I want to get your reactions to this. It's quintessentially an illustration of power, and that is the norm of prohibiting the use of the word and the social behavior of punishing and sanctioning those who do, ending the career of a public performer who uses the word without, you know, appropriate cover,
mm-hmm.
and so on. Now, I'm trying to understand the logic of it. And it seems to go as follows, and again, I invite your comment. The logic seems to be, I'm looking to find racists. There are racists out there, okay? Bad people. They're good people and bad people. On the issue of race, they're bad people. I don't know who they are. It's important for me to identify who they are, otherwise they might hurt me. They're not going to tell me if I ask them, but I may be able to infer that they are from certain behaviors that they engage in. Now, the prohibition on the use of the N-word, the word is nigger. The prohibition on uttering it, okay? I'm just talking about it as, I don't know, free speech or just kind of linguistic. To my mind, it's an extraordinary phenomenon because it's just a word, okay? How I uttered it, what was the meaning behind my utterance of it, would seem to be preeminently significant. If indeed I was using it to try to denigrate somebody, like calling someone a kike or a spick or a mick or something like that, I could see a person being insulted by that. Those are fighting words. I get that. A person who speaks that way casually or to express that kind of prejudice or contempt deserves to be condemned. But there are many, many ways of using the word, many ways of using it. That's one point. The other, who uses it? Now I'm going to have a different judgment based upon, now all of this seems to come back to the idea that I think the conditional probability, speak like a decision theorist, the conditional probability that the user is a racist, given that they've uttered this word, has been raised above some threshold of tolerance such that I'm not sure they're racist, but I'm sure enough that I don't want to associate with them anymore. And I'm trying to understand that because it seems like that phenomenon could have a kind of self-fulfilling dynamic to it. Because once everybody knows that you're not supposed to use the word, who are the people who are actually going to use it in defiance of the convention? The word now becomes a way of signaling that I'm a racist. If I'm actually a racist, if I'm a follower of David Duke or I'm one of these white supremacists, I want to use the word in order so people, my buddies and everybody else in the world can know that I'm willing to use the word. But that has only happened because you have condemned the use of the word by other people who are using it in a different context. Why is it a good thing to give the racists a way of surefire identifying themselves? Or why is it a good thing to indulge in a punishment regime that sanctions so many people who are on the borderline of moral turpitude? They might not be bad people at all. They're going to be a lot of false positives. When you start punishing everybody who uses the word, they say the word nigger. I said it yet again. What are you going to do to me? Like that. And what I'm saying is it's false power. It's false power. It's a certain kind of social cachet. I get to define who can use that word. Darn it, you use the word. You use the word. It's a certain kind of pout, certain kind of tantrum over in the corner somewhere, but it is an evidence of weakness.
It is. And here, Shelby Steele, should get a payment because he's the one who put this best, although it wasn't about this word. That's about insecurity. You're right. It's about power. It's gotten to the point, and it's getting to the point where it's easy to forget that it wasn't this way in what I at least think of as modern times. But it's gotten to the point where that word has become not just a slur, but it's taboo. So it's not just you can't call somebody nigger. You can't even say the word. We're even on thin ice here using it ourselves, and we're black. That's the way it is now because it's no longer a slur. It's a religious totem. That's how profanity works. It's now become a profanity. And what's key is that I have evidence of this, and I need to transfer this into a different medium because it must be decaying now. The very first media interview I ever did was in 1995. It was local Bay Area radio. I think it was Oakland. Somebody, for some reason, wanted to know about what I'm now calling the N-word. And I remember, this is 23 years ago, I was not experienced with these things. And, the word nigger was the last thing I was thinking about. I was just studying my Creole languages. But I do remember that we could all use the word freely, including the white announcer. The idea was, of course, nobody's calling anybody that. We're talking about the word. And so you just used it. And that was 1995. There was an internet. I don't know if there was Viagra, but there were all sorts of things that make up modern times. And yet everything was fine. The sky didn't fall in. This notion that you can't use the word at all is something relatively new. And it's a badge of insecurity. It's something that is not anything any one person created. But the idea is if you even refer to that word, we can make an enormous noise and talk about what we've been through. And of course, what you're noticing is the contradiction, which is that it's weakness as strength. The idea being, you enunciated a couple of syllables and this reduces me to tears or, sparks me into fury because of people who were hanging from trees in the 1930s and because of horrible things that happened in the more recent past. How dare you say that? You must apologize. And of course, nobody can genuinely apologize. Once you say it, you're shit forever. And yeah, that is somebody who doesn't have an inner sense of their own worth based on real things. And of course, here with this Manichaean reasoning that we've been talking about. Many people think that if you say that, you mean there's something wrong with black people. No, it's not that. It's slavery and Jim Crow, and then it gets a little more complicated. After the 60s, a whole zeitgeist that encourages a people to think more about the past than the present and to build an identity around racism. And that came from within the black community as well as from outside, where a new woke intelligentsia was ready to support a people in that and think of it as progressive. All that's kind of complicated, but that is why this new identity based on calling for weakness and thinking of it as strength has happened. And satirists like to look at it and call it complicated, which it is. But yes, you're right. It's also, it's very sad. No, you shouldn't be able to haul off and call somebody a dirty name. Although, of course, if somebody does do it, any self-regarding person is not going to fall to pieces. The word's been used against me about 1.5 times, and both times I just kind of thought, what a lowly person to go there. They lose just in saying it, and then I went on with my life. And many people would say, well, John, that's because you're, and I would say, no, it's not because I'm anything. It's because I'm normal. And I think that we've lost normal. And yeah, it's because of this idea that Black people's strength is in showing how weak we are, such that you're going to say, for example, that the reason that middle-class Black kids don't get into top schools in numbers as large as we'd expect or desire is because of redlining in 1963. That's a very unusual way of being a race, to be that focused upon increasingly distant history. But it's because of this twisted way that we've been encouraged to think about ourselves. Yeah, I think a lot of people don't get it because we are trained to cry weakness and call that a fist up in the air. And, I think that it doesn't make any sense. And the occasional person is comfortable admitting it. And here we are.
Yeah, well, I think here we are too, John, perhaps at the end of our hour of dialogue without having discussed the affirmative action case. It gives us a subject to discuss.
Well, that'll be
next
coming.
time we talk. Unless you have a significant observation that you want to make.
Glenn, I want to say one quick thing. When I was talking about Black kids in school and being given a hard time, and I said, okay, the reason for Black underperformance in school today, therefore, is not due to racism and it's not due to inferiority. I meant it's not due to current racism, if anybody happened to be listening to me saying that. So yes, it's due to racism in 1966, but it's not due to racism now. Just wanted to be clear.
Might it be due to the fact that the kid is spending too much time watching TV? Might it be due to the fact that the kid's peer group doesn't think it's all that cool to be a nerd?
Mm-hmm, it does. And the TV is because the very well-intentioned parents let the kid watch more TV than the Jewish couple's kids across town would. And none of them are thinking of any of this consciously, but it's because of that kind of disconnect.
I want to be clear. I'm not asserting that as a fact. That would be determined by empirical evidence from surveys that I don't have access to.
Black kids in the 90s.
I'm just saying, how can I rule it out a priori?
In the 90s, Black kids were measured in various studies to watch more TV. And, their parents were the ones who were being made fun of by white teachers in 1966. It all makes perfect sense.
So here's an example. I know we're concluding, but here's an example. It's the school discipline debate. The new education department, Trump, Betsy DeVos, they've just come out with revised guidelines and so forth, and that's been controversial. And my wife, LaJuan, gets mad at me every time we discuss this because she violently disagrees with the point I'm about to make, which is that you have a racial disparity in the suspension rates of Black kids higher than white kids at schools. And the previous administration's basic response to that was the school districts need to get those numbers in order and need to look at what they're doing. They might be discriminating. But another response is, oh my God, higher suspension rate for Black kids is telling me something about the behaviors that those kids are bringing into the classrooms, the disruptive behaviors that lead to them being suspended. Yeah. What if the school district is not racially biased? What if there's really a significant racial disparity in the disruptive behavior that occasions suspension with Black kids coming in higher? What if something is going on in their homes and their neighborhoods? What if they're bringing attitudes into the school about their relationship to the enterprise of that institution, which are inconsistent with the well-functioning of the institution? Where do we need to reform? How do I know just from the fact of a disparity that the reform needs to be happening at the school level? And to get that one wrong is enormously costly. To get the one wrong about why the kids, the gangbangers with the guns on the streets of these cities are killing each other and innocent bystanders in such numbers, to get that wrong, to attribute that to racial segregation and the housing market in Chicago in 1950, when in fact it's fathers who are not at home raising sons who become indisciplined as a consequence of that. I don't know that that's true. I just admit that it's a possibility that it could be true. It's at least as plausible. The absent fathers, the indisciplined sons, the violent behavior and the death, that causal chain is at least as plausible as the housing market dispossessed African Americans of wealth that prevented them from being able to move into nicer neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Could there not be a subculture of violence amongst African Americans? some African Americans by class, by geographical, whatever. We could go into it. I don't know that it's true. I don't know that it's false either. Okay. To get it wrong, this is the point I'm trying to make. The point's an epistemic point about how do you know how the world actually is so that you can effectively intervene in the world. To get it wrong, because you're ashamed, because you're afraid, because you're a coward, you can't face the possibility that there could be something warranting your own responsibility to engage with and repair within your community and the way that you're living. To get that wrong, no, I mean, so there's an intellectual, you see what I'm saying here? There's political, there's social, there's also an intellectual. It's about how we're thinking about things, misunderstanding, misapprehending, misattributing.
Yeah, I've got to be, I don't mean to go against Lawan, but I've got to be on your side. The data.
By the way, she told me to say hello to you.
Hello, Lawan. I look forward to seeing you in a couple months. No, I've seen this, and this is like the worst kind of argument, but I've seen this. My wife used to teach in a West Harlem public school, not violent, but rickety. A lot of the sorts of things you read about. Nobody is, coming in with a knife, but it had a lot of the kinds of problems that you heard about. And I watched her class. I was there for a whole day. And it wasn't that everybody in the class was some sort of reprobate, but there were two people, predictably, they were boys. There were two boys who, were just, one, they were adolescents, but to be honest, I was in school as an adolescent and nobody acted like this. They were these kids who had to show off their sassy senses of humor, who would not sit down. One of them had an air about him where if you crossed him the wrong way, he just might, pull something with his hand or something like that. And of course, he never did, at least not when my wife was there, but you couldn't help get the feeling. And of course, he's bigger than my wife. It took two, I remember their names. I won't say them now. It took two people like that. And it really did make it so that the class learned less because they wouldn't behave. Now I can just imagine what it would have been like if they were actually overtly violent people. But the rules were such that my wife couldn't get rid of them. And it really did affect the educational experience of all but one, predictably, girl in the class who was able to rise above it and make the most of it nevertheless. But let's face it, that's not most kids. And here in New York, the data is in. Once this laxer policy came in, and I was completely open to seeing that there had been this subtle bias against Black boys. It's not like that's impossible either. But no, the schools in the worst neighborhoods, which is where most of these sorts of actions have been necessary, ended up having sharp upticks in violence, in gang activity, and in the use of substances in school. Sharp uptick immediately to the point that you could not even entertain that this was not a matter of cause rather than correlation. The data's in. And so if the people who need more discipline tend to be boys and Black, the idea that that is due simply to racism is one that, goodness, you're really going to have to defend. And more to the point, if the idea is that whatever the cause is, it's racist to take those kids out of school, we need to change our definitions because this sort of thing is destroying the educational opportunities of brown kids. And I've seen the same thing in Philadelphia in terms of news reports, not...
I want to say one thing since we're in agreement and we're closing, and we are in agreement, that suspension does not have to be the only response to the behavioral problem of these kids. It is one tool. You could have more social workers in the school and counseling. You could try to reach out to parents and engage them in the thing. I ain't saying that easy. That's easy. I'm not saying that would necessarily work. I just want to acknowledge that there could be a side debate among people, all of whom agree on the possibility that behavioral practices characteristic of too many African-American youngsters in the schools are disruptive to the classroom and create a real educational problem that have to be dealt with, and are not healthy for the kids as well and should be dealt with. We can all agree, people can agree with us about that and still say removing the kid from the school for some period of time is not the best administrative practice for countering that behavior. Sure. I'm not necessarily taking that position. I'm just saying there are two separate questions here.
They are. They definitely are.
Thanks a lot, John. We are the Black Guys at bloggingheads.tv signing off. It's been real, as they say. Take care, my friend.
You too.